In 2019, investigative journalist David Enrich discovered documents buried deep in the Delaware corporate registry that would change everything we thought we knew about American financial power. The papers had been filed quietly, without fanfare, hidden among thousands of routine corporate filings that few would ever read. For months, these documents had sat in plain sight, their true significance invisible to casual observers. The filing date was March 15, 2019, the Ides of March, though whether this timing was coincidental or deliberate would never be confirmed. What the documents revealed was a web of property ownership, shell companies, and financial structures that traced back to one name: Lawrence Douglas Fink. At first glance, the paperwork seemed mundane. Real estate transactions, corporate restructuring, the kind of legal maneuvering that happens thousands of times each day in America's financial centers. But as Enrich dug deeper, following paper trails through Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands, a disturbing pattern emerged. The documents weren't just about money, they were about power. Raw, unchecked power exercised from behind the walls of a private estate that most Americans had never heard of. The property in question sits on 47 pristine acres in North Salem, New York, just 90 minutes north of Manhattan. To the casual observer driving past its stone gates, it appears to be nothing more than another wealthy executive's country retreat. The kind of place where corporate titans escape the pressures of Wall Street for weekend rounds of golf and charity galas. Local residents know it simply as the Fink place, if they think about it at all. But the documents Enrich uncovered told a different story. They revealed that this estate, with its sprawling Georgian Revival mansion, private landing strip, and underground conference facilities, serves as something far more significant than a weekend getaway. According to the filings, it functions as an unofficial command center for financial decisions that affect the economic fate of nations. A place where the future of entire industries is decided over private dinners, where the flow of trillions of dollars is directed through handshake agreements that never appear in any official record. The mansion itself was purchased in 2007 for $14.3 million, but subsequent filings showed additional investments totaling over $30 million in renovations, expansions, and what the documents cryptically described as specialized communications infrastructure. Security upgrades alone accounted for $4.2 million, including what one contractor's invoice described as tactical-grade surveillance systems and hardened communication bunkers. What made Enrich's discovery particularly chilling was not just the scale of the financial power emanating from this estate, but the methodical secrecy surrounding its operations. The property ownership had been deliberately obscured through a maze of limited liability companies, each incorporated in different states, each with different registered agents, all ultimately controlled by trusts that traced back to BlackRock, Inc., the world's largest asset management firm, controlling over $10 trillion in global assets. BlackRock's official headquarters may be in Manhattan, but the documents suggested that its real decision-making heart beats from behind the gates of this North Salem estate, where corporate boards meet, where economic policies are shaped, where the invisible hand of the market reveals itself to be very human indeed. The public has long known Larry Fink as BlackRock's chairman and CEO, the man who built a financial empire from nothing and became one of the most powerful unelected figures in global economics. His public image is that of a thoughtful steward of other people's money, a fiduciary who takes seriously his responsibility to pension funds, university endowments, and individual retirement accounts. Press profiles describe him as humble despite his wealth, principled despite his power. But the documents in Enrich's possession painted a more complex picture. They revealed private communications between Fink and government officials, meeting logs that showed central bank governors, treasury secretaries, and Federal Reserve chairs making pilgrimages to the North Salem estate. Financial records that demonstrated how BlackRock's investment decisions, made in the privacy of Fink's mansion, could trigger market movements that destroyed or created billions in wealth overnight. Most disturbing of all were the guest logs, names that appeared repeatedly over the years, technology CEOs whose companies BlackRock held massive stakes in, defense contractors whose Pentagon deals coincided with BlackRock's investment timing, energy executives whose regulatory challenges seemed to disappear after dinner meetings at the estate. A pattern of coordination that raised troubling questions about market manipulation, regulatory capped, and the concentration of economic power in the hands of a single institution. The estate's underground conference facilities, according to architectural plans filed with Westchester County, included a situation room equipped with secure satellite links to major financial exchanges, government agencies, and BlackRock's global offices. The plans showed blast-resistant construction, electromagnetic shielding, and backup power systems that could maintain operations for weeks during a national emergency. This wasn't just a wealthy man's home. It was a fortress designed to maintain financial control, even in the event of societal collapse. Yet perhaps the most unsettling revelation in Rich's documents was their mundane tone. There was no evil mastermind plotting global domination, no sinister cabal meeting in shadowy chambers. Instead, there were spreadsheets and conference call transcripts that revealed something potentially more dangerous. A system so normalized, so institutionalized, that its operators seemed genuinely unaware of the democratic threat they posed. A machine so powerful it had become invisible even to those who operated its controls. But to understand how this concentration of power came to rest in the hands of one man, and how it came to be exercised from behind the gates of a private estate in New York's horse country, we must travel back to a different time and place. Back to a working-class neighborhood in Los Angeles, where a young Larry Fink first learned the lessons that would one day shake the global economy. Humble beginnings. The story of BlackRock's private estate begins not with the acquisition of power, but with its complete absence. Lawrence Douglas Fink was born on November 2, 1952, in Van Nuys, California, a sprawling middle-class suburb in the San Fernando Valley that most Americans would recognize as thoroughly, unremarkably ordinary. His father, Frederick Fink, sold shoes at a local department store. His mother, Leela, worked part-time as a bookkeeper. They were the second generation of a Jewish family that had immigrated from Eastern Europe, carrying with them the immigrants' twin obsessions: education and economic security. The Fink family lived in a modest two-bedroom ranch house on Saticoy Street, where young Larry shared a room with his older brother Stephen until he was 12. The house had a single bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for 4 people to eat together, and a living room dominated by a black and white television that received 3 reliable channels. By any measure, it was a world away from the marble-floored mansion that would one day serve as the nerve center of global finance. But if the Fink household lacked material abundance, it compensated with intellectual ambition. Frederick Fink had never attended college. His own father's early death had forced him into the workforce at 16. But he possessed the immigrant's fierce determination that his children would climb higher. Every evening after dinner, as Leela cleared the dishes, Frederick would spread the day's newspapers across the small kitchen table and walk his sons through the business section, explaining stock prices, corporate earnings, and economic trends with the patient intensity of a man who understood that knowledge was the only inheritance he could leave them. Larry's earliest memory was of sitting on his father's lap at that kitchen table, watching Frederick trace his finger under headlines about companies like IBM, General Motors, and AT&T. "The numbers tell stories," Frederick would say, his voice carrying the slight accent that revealed his parents' origins in Poland. Learn to read the stories, and you learn how the world really works. It was a lesson that would prove prophetic, though neither father nor son could have imagined how thoroughly Larry would one day master those stories. The boy who would grow up to control trillions of dollars was, by all accounts, unremarkable in his early years. Teachers described him as intelligent but not brilliant, hardworking but not obsessive. He played basketball with moderate skill, earned B's and occasional A's, and showed no particular aptitude for mathematics beyond what was expected of a bright middle-class child. His most notable characteristic was persistence, a quiet, methodical determination that his parents attributed to his father's influence, and his teachers simply noted as good study habits. The family's financial situation improved gradually through Larry's childhood. Frederick's steady work ethic earned him promotions within the shoe store, and eventually he saved enough to buy a small stake in the business itself. Leela's bookkeeping skills proved valuable to several local businesses, and by Larry's high school years, the Finks had moved to a larger house in nearby Northridge, complete with separate bedrooms for the boys and a dining room that Frederick used as a home office where he could spread out his expanding collection of financial newspapers and investment magazines. It was in that dining room that 16-year-old Larry first encountered the Wall Street Journal. Frederick had begun subscribing to the paper as his own investment knowledge grew, and Larry found himself drawn to its dense pages of corporate news and market data. Where other teenagers might have been bored by discussions of price-earnings ratios and quarterly earnings, Larry discovered a world that felt like a vast puzzle waiting to be solved. The mathematical precision of financial markets appealed to his orderly mind, while the human drama behind corporate fortunes satisfied something deeper, a growing fascination with power and how it was accumulated, deployed, and lost. The transformation from curious teenager to focused young man occurred during Larry's senior year at Van Nuys High School. His government teacher, Mrs. Elizabeth Cartwright, assigned a semester-long project requiring students to track a portfolio of imaginary stock investments. While most of his classmates chose familiar companies like McDonald's or Disney, Larry selected a diverse mix of obscure firms in emerging industries: early computer companies, biotechnology startups, energy exploration firms. He spent hours each day after school in the public library, researching corporate filings and industry trends, building elaborate charts that tracked not just stock prices but patent filings, management changes, and regulatory developments. When the semester ended, Larry's imaginary portfolio had outperformed the S&P 500 by 12%. More importantly, he had discovered his calling: the methodical research, the pattern recognition, the ability to see connections that others missed. It felt like coming home to abilities he hadn't known he possessed. Mrs. Cartwright, recognizing something exceptional in her quiet student's work, arranged a meeting with the school's college counselor. "This boy has a gift," she said. "We need to get him somewhere he can develop it." That somewhere turned out to be UCLA, where Larry enrolled in 1970 as a political science major with a minor in economics. The choice of political science over pure economics was deliberate. Even at 18, he understood instinctively that financial power was inseparable from political power, that understanding markets required understanding the regulatory and governmental frameworks within which they operated. It was a sophisticated insight for a teenager from Van Nuys, and it would prove crucial to his later success. College life introduced Larry to a world of privilege he had previously known only through newspaper financial pages. His dormmates included the children of entertainment executives, oil company heirs, and third-generation real estate dynasties. Initially, he felt the sting of social inadequacy. His clothes were clearly from department stores rather than boutiques. His spending money came from a part-time job at a campus coffee shop rather than family allowances. and his spring breaks were spent at home in the valley rather than on ski slopes in Aspen. But if economic insecurity was painful, it was also motivating. Larry threw himself into his studies with an intensity that impressed even his academically driven parents. He graduated summa cum laude in 1974, earning admission to UCLA's Anderson School of Management for his MBA. His thesis project examined the emerging field of pension fund management, arguing that institutional investors would become increasingly important drivers of market behavior as retirement savings grew throughout the 1970s and beyond. The paper earned academic praise for its analytical rigor, but its true significance lay in its prescient identification of where future financial power would be concentrated. By the time Larry Fink received his MBA in 1976, he had transformed from a shoe salesman's son into something new, a young man who combined the immigrant's hunger for security with the analyst's ability to see patterns invisible to others. He possessed no family connections, no inherited wealth, no obvious advantages beyond intelligence and determination. What he did have was perfect timing. Wall Street in the late 1970s was on the verge of revolutionary changes: the deregulation of financial markets, the computerization of trading, the explosive growth of institutional investing. That would reward exactly his combination of analytical skill and institutional knowledge. The boy from Van Nuys was ready to enter the world of high finance, carrying with him the lessons learned at his father's kitchen table: that numbers tell stories, that knowledge is power, and that understanding how money flows is the first step toward controlling where it goes. He could not have known, as he prepared to leave Los Angeles for New York, that he was embarking on a journey that would lead to the construction of a financial empire so vast it would require its own private fortress to manage. But that empire's foundation was already in place, built not from inherited privilege or family connections, but from the methodical patience of a working-class family that understood the value of education, preparation, and the long view. The mansion in North Salem would rise decades later, but its true cornerstone was laid in a two-bedroom house in Van Nuys, where a shoe salesman taught his son to read the stories that numbers tell. Wall Street. In September 1976, Larry Fink arrived at Grand Central Terminal carrying a single suitcase and a job offer from First Boston Corporation. The contrast between the marble grandeur of the station and the modest apartment he had rented in Queens could not have been starker. His studio on Northern Boulevard cost $185 per month and featured a Murphy bed, a kitchenette barely large enough for two people, and a view of a parking lot. It was a world away from the Van Nuys ranch house, but it was also exactly what an ambitious 24-year-old could afford on a first-year associate's salary of $22,000. First Boston in the late 1970s was a prestigious but traditional investment bank, populated largely by Ivy League graduates whose fathers had worked on Wall Street before them. Larry's UCLA credentials and working-class background made him an outsider from his first day, but they also gave him advantages his better-connected colleagues lacked. While they moved through the financial world with the casual confidence of inherited privilege, he approached every transaction with the methodical intensity of someone who understood that failure meant returning to the valley with nothing to show for his ambitions. The young man who reported to work each morning at 8:30 a.m. and rarely left before 10 p.m. quickly distinguished himself through sheer analytical horsepower. His colleagues might have better networking skills and more polished presentation styles, but none could match his ability to dissect complex financial structures or spot risks that others missed. His first major assignment involved analyzing the pension fund investments of a large manufacturing company, work that drew on both his academic research and his intuitive understanding of how institutional money moved through markets. Within 18 months, Larry had been promoted to senior associate and assigned to First Boston's fixed income division, where he found his true calling in the emerging world of mortgage-backed securities. The concept was revolutionary for its time. Banks could package thousands of individual home mortgages into bonds that could be sold to institutional investors, simultaneously spreading risk and freeing up capital for additional lending. It was financial engineering at its most sophisticated, requiring exactly the kind of pattern recognition and analytical depth that Larry had honed since his high school stock-picking days. His breakthrough moment came in 1979, when he identified a fundamental flaw in how most firms were calculating the interest rate risk in their mortgage portfolios. Traditional models assumed that homeowners would behave predictably, refinancing when rates dropped, staying put when they rose. But Larry's analysis revealed that real borrower behavior was far more complex, influenced by factors like local employment conditions, seasonal moving patterns, and demographic trends that conventional models ignored entirely. Armed with this insight, Larry developed new mathematical models that could predict mortgage prepayment rates with unprecedented accuracy. When First Boston's traders began using his models to guide their investment decisions, the results were spectacular. The firm's mortgage trading desk generated profits of $47 million in 1980, compared to $12 million the previous year. Larry's bonus that year was $67,000, more money than his father had earned in any single year of his life. But success bred ambition, and by 1981, Larry was growing restless within First Boston's hierarchical structure. His models had made the firm millions, but the credit went to senior partners while he remained a well-compensated analyst. More troubling, he was beginning to see how the traditional Wall Street partnership model concentrated risk in ways that could prove catastrophic. Partners were personally liable for trading losses, but the growing complexity of financial markets made it increasingly difficult to understand where those risks actually lay. The solution came from an unexpected source: his former UCLA classmate Ralph Schlosstein, who had joined Lehman Brothers and was working on a revolutionary concept called asset management. Rather than risking the firm's own capital through proprietary trading, asset management involved collecting fees for investing other people's money. It was a model that promised steady profits without catastrophic downside risk, exactly the kind of business structure that appealed to Larry's risk-conscious nature. In 1982, Larry made his first major career gamble, leaving First Boston to join Lehman Brothers as a senior vice president in their newly formed asset management division. The move raised eyebrows throughout the industry. Asset management was considered a sleepy backwater compared to the adrenaline rush of trading floors. But Larry understood something that most of his peers missed: the explosive growth of pension funds, university endowments, and insurance company reserves meant that institutional assets under management would grow exponentially throughout the 1980s. The real money wasn't in trading. It was in collecting management fees on an ever-expanding pool of institutional capital. At Lehman, Larry found the platform he needed to prove his theories about institutional investing. Working 18-hour days from a cluttered office overlooking the East River, he developed increasingly sophisticated models for managing fixed-income portfolios. His approach combined rigorous mathematical analysis with intuitive understanding of how different types of institutions, pension funds, insurance companies, university endowments, had different risk tolerances and return requirements. The transformation of Larry Fink from gifted analyst to industry innovator accelerated rapidly during his Lehman years. In 1984, he launched the firm's first quantitatively managed bond fund, using computer models to identify mispriced securities across global fixed-income markets. The fund's performance was extraordinary: 14.6% annual returns over its first 3 years, compared to 9.8% for comparable benchmarks. More importantly, the fund demonstrated that systematic, model-driven investing could consistently outperform traditional portfolio management approaches. By 1986, Larry had been promoted to head of Lehman's entire asset management division, responsible for over $2 billion in institutional assets. His success attracted attention from pension fund executives, university treasurers, and insurance company investment officers, exactly the kind of institutional relationships that would prove crucial to his future plans. They were drawn not just to his track record, but to his ability to explain complex investment strategies in clear, logical terms that fiduciaries could understand and defend to their own stakeholders. The decade of the 1980s also brought personal transformation. In 1979, Larry had married Lori Milken, a UCLA graduate who worked in public relations for entertainment companies. Their wedding was a modest affair at a Westchester country club, attended by family and close friends rather than the elaborate society events that marked Wall Street partnerships. Lori's practical nature and emotional intelligence provided perfect counterbalance to Larry's analytical intensity. She understood instinctively that her husband's professional ambitions required unwavering support, but she also insisted on maintaining a family life that remained grounded in middle-class values. Their first child, Joshua, was born in 1981, followed by Ali in 1983 and Matthew in 1986. The growing family moved from Queens to a modest four-bedroom colonial in Scarsdale, chosen primarily for its excellent public schools and easy commute to Manhattan. The house on Ardsley Road was comfortable but far from ostentatious, the home of successful professionals, not financial royalty. Larry's home office occupied a converted bedroom, where he would spend weekend hours refining investment models and reading academic research on portfolio theory and risk management. Despite his growing wealth and professional recognition, Larry remained deeply connected to his working-class origins. Frederick and Leila Fink visited New York twice yearly, staying in the guest room and marveling at their son's transformation while maintaining their own unpretentious values. Frederick still read the Wall Street Journal every morning, but now he called Larry weekly to discuss market developments and sought his son's advice on the family's modest investment portfolio. The success of Lehman's asset management division under Larry's leadership established him as one of Wall Street's rising stars by the mid-1980s. Industry publications profiled him as a new-generation money manager who combined quantitative rigor with institutional sophistication. Investment conferences competed to feature him as a keynote speaker. Headhunters regularly approached him with offers from rival firms seeking to replicate Lehman's asset management success. But even as Larry's reputation grew, he was beginning to envision something far more ambitious than climbing the corporate ladder at an established firm. The asset management industry was still fragmented among dozens of medium-sized firms, each serving relatively narrow institutional niches. Larry saw an opportunity to build something unprecedented, a truly global asset management company that could serve every type of institutional investor across all asset classes. The mathematical models and technological infrastructure required for such an enterprise would demand enormous upfront investment, but the potential returns were staggering. In late 1987, as Wall Street reeled from the October market crash, Larry began quietly developing plans for his own asset management firm. The crash had demonstrated once again how traditional Wall Street partnerships could be destroyed overnight by unforeseen market movements. But an asset management company collecting steady fees regardless of market direction could not only survive such volatility but actually benefit from it, as nervous institutions sought more sophisticated risk management. The man who had learned to read the stories that numbers tell was preparing to write a story of his own. A story that would transform the sleepy world of asset management into the most powerful force in global finance. A story that would require its own private command center, surrounded by walls high enough to keep the world's attention focused on what happened inside rather than who controlled what happened outside. The foundation was nearly complete. All that remained was to build the empire itself. Empire rising. The birth of BlackRock occurred not in a moment of triumph, but in a conference room at the Blackstone Group on a bitter February morning in 1988. Larry Fink sat across a polished mahogany table from Stephen Schwarzman and Peter Peterson, two men who would themselves become legends of private equity, discussing terms for what seemed like a modest venture, a new asset management subsidiary focused on fixed income investing. The irony would not become apparent for years, that this meeting between three future titans of finance took place in a room overlooking Park Avenue, barely 5 miles from where BlackRock's private estate would eventually command its own domain over the global economy. The deal seemed straightforward enough. Blackstone would provide $5 million in startup capital and back-office support in exchange for 50% ownership of the new firm. Larry would have operational control and the remaining equity, along with the freedom to recruit his own team and develop his proprietary risk management systems. For Schwarzman and Peterson, it represented a relatively small bet on the growing institutional asset management market. For Larry, it was the platform he needed to prove his theories about systematic, technology-driven investing on a massive scale. The name BlackRock emerged from a brainstorming session that stretched past midnight in Larry's Scarsdale study. He wanted something that conveyed both the solidity of traditional asset management and the analytical rigor of modern portfolio theory. Black suggested the sophisticated mathematical models that were becoming his signature, the black boxes that could process vast amounts of market data and identify investment opportunities invisible to human analysis. Rock conveyed stability and permanence, essential qualities for institutions entrusting their long-term liabilities to external managers. Larry's first hire was Susan Wagner, a brilliant Princeton graduate who had worked alongside him at Lehman Brothers. Wagner understood both the technical complexity of fixed-income mathematics and the institutional dynamics that drove pension fund decision-making. More importantly, she shared Larry's vision of building something fundamentally different from existing asset management firms, a company that would compete not through marketing or relationships, but through superior analytical capabilities and risk management. The early BlackRock team assembled in a cramped suite of offices at 345 Park Avenue, working with second-hand furniture and borrowed computer terminals. The contrast with the mahogany-paneled executive suites at established firms like Morgan Stanley Asset Management or Fidelity Investments could not have been starker. But what BlackRock lacked in prestige, it compensated for through intellectual intensity. Larry had recruited not traditional portfolio managers, but mathematicians, computer scientists, and former Federal Reserve economists who understood how to build systematic investment processes. The firm's breakthrough came through a concept Larry called Aladdin, an integrated risk management and portfolio construction system that could analyze thousands of securities simultaneously, stress-test portfolios against multiple economic scenarios, and identify optimal asset allocation strategies. The name was deliberately playful, a reference to the magical lamp that granted its owner unlimited power, but the underlying technology was revolutionary. No other asset management firm possessed anything approaching Aladdin's analytical capabilities. BlackRock's first major client was General Electric's pension fund, won through a combination of Larry's personal relationship with GE's treasurer and a presentation that demonstrated Aladdin's ability to generate superior risk-adjusted returns. The initial mandate was modest, $375 million in fixed-income assets, but it validated Larry's belief that sophisticated institutional investors would pay premium fees for genuinely superior investment technology. More importantly, it provided the track record needed to attract additional clients. The transformation from startup to major player accelerated throughout the early 1990s. BlackRock's systematic investment approach consistently outperformed traditional active managers, while Aladdin's risk management capabilities prevented the kind of catastrophic losses that periodically destroyed competitors. Assets under management grew from $17 billion in 1992 to $53 billion by 1995, making BlackRock one of the fastest-growing institutional asset managers in history. But growth brought new challenges. As BlackRock's assets reached critical mass, Larry confronted the limitations of remaining a Blackstone subsidiary. Major pension funds and university endowments preferred to work directly with asset management firms rather than divisions of larger financial companies. More problematically, Blackstone's private equity activities occasionally created conflicts of interest, situations where BlackRock might be evaluating investments in companies that Blackstone was simultaneously considering for leveraged buyouts. The solution required Larry's most audacious gamble yet. In 1995, he approached Schwarzman and Peterson with a proposal to take BlackRock public, using the proceeds to buy out Blackstone's ownership stake and establish the firm as an independent public company. The negotiation process was brutal. Schwarzman initially demanded terms that would have left Larry with minimal control over his own creation, but eventually both sides recognized the mutual benefits of separation. BlackRock's initial public offering on October 1, 1999, raised $126 million and valued the company at $4.2 billion. Larry retained 47% ownership, making him worth over $1.9 billion on paper at age 46. But more important than personal wealth was strategic freedom. As an independent public company, BlackRock could pursue acquisitions, expand into new asset classes, and build the global infrastructure required for Larry's ultimate vision. That vision was becoming increasingly clear. BlackRock would not merely compete within the existing asset management industry, but would fundamentally transform how institutional investing worked. Traditional asset managers offered either active management, expensive, inconsistent, and often unsuccessful, or passive index funds that provided market returns but no value-added services. Larry saw an opportunity to create a third category: systematic active management that combined the consistency of index funds with the return potential of active strategies. The key was Aladdin's evolution from a risk management tool into a comprehensive investment operating system. By the early 2000s, Aladdin could process real-time data feeds from every major financial market, analyze correlation patterns across tens of thousands of securities, and generate optimal portfolio recommendations updated continuously throughout trading days. More importantly, it could do this not just for BlackRock's own funds, but for any institution willing to license the technology. The Aladdin licensing business became BlackRock's secret weapon in pursuing major acquisitions. When Larry identified attractive takeover targets, established asset management firms with valuable client relationships but outdated technology, he could offer something no competitor could match: immediate access to the world's most sophisticated investment management platform. Target companies, existing investment professionals, could dramatically improve their performance simply by plugging into Aladdin's analytical capabilities. This strategy proved devastatingly effective during the consolidation wave that swept the asset management industry throughout the 2000s. BlackRock's acquisition of State Street Research and Management in 2004 added $43 billion in assets and established the firm as a major player in equity investing. The 2006 purchase of Merrill Lynch Investment Managers brought another $341 billion in assets and global distribution capabilities. Each acquisition was immediately integrated into Aladdin's platform, creating operational synergies that justified premium acquisition prices. But the transaction that transformed BlackRock from major player to global hegemon was the 2009 acquisition of Barclays Global Investors during the depths of the financial crisis. BGI managed $1.5 trillion in assets, more than doubling BlackRock's size overnight, and included the iShares exchange-traded fund business that would become crucial to BlackRock's future dominance. The $13.5 billion purchase price seemed enormous, but it positioned BlackRock to benefit from two massive secular trends: the shift from active to passive investing and the explosive growth of ETF assets. The financial crisis also demonstrated Aladdin's value in ways that no marketing campaign could have achieved. While traditional asset managers struggled with portfolio losses and client redemptions, BlackRock's systematic risk management approach limited downside exposure and actually attracted new assets from institutions seeking safer alternatives. The Federal Reserve and Treasury Department regularly consulted with Larry about systemic risks and potential policy responses, establishing him as the unofficial advisor to government officials managing the crisis. By 2010, BlackRock managed over $3.4 trillion in assets, making it larger than most national economies. Larry had achieved something unprecedented in financial services, building a firm that was simultaneously the world's largest asset manager, the dominant provider of investment technology, and an unofficial advisor to central banks and treasury departments worldwide. The company that had started with $5 million in borrowed capital now controlled financial flows large enough to destabilize entire countries. The infrastructure required to manage this empire was staggering. BlackRock employed over 12,000 people across 30 countries, operating trading floors that never closed and maintaining data centers capable of processing millions of transactions daily. The firm's Manhattan headquarters occupied 17 floors of a midtown skyscraper, featuring crisis management facilities that could maintain operations during national emergencies. But as BlackRock's influence expanded beyond traditional asset management into systemic importance for global financial stability, Larry began to recognize that the firm needed something more than corporate headquarters. It needed a place where the most sensitive decisions could be made away from public scrutiny, where government officials could meet with BlackRock executives without attracting media attention, and where the firm's leadership could coordinate responses to crises that might threaten the stability of markets themselves. The solution would require moving beyond Manhattan's glass towers to somewhere more private, more secure, and more suitable for the kind of power that BlackRock had accumulated. Somewhere that could serve as both fortress and command center for an empire that had grown beyond anything the financial world had previously imagined. The search for such a place would lead Larry Fink to 47 acres of pristine countryside in North Salem, New York, where the next chapter of BlackRock's story would be written behind walls high enough to keep the world's attention focused on what happened inside. Ultimate power. By 2007, Larry Fink had achieved something no financier in history had accomplished. He controlled a firm whose investment decisions affected the daily lives of nearly every person on Earth. BlackRock's $4.1 trillion in assets under management meant that the firm owned meaningful stakes in virtually every major publicly traded company in the developed world. When BlackRock's portfolio managers decided to buy or sell positions, entire industries responded. When Larry spoke at investment conferences, currency markets moved. When BlackRock published research reports, central banks paid attention. The scale of this influence was unprecedented, but it was also largely invisible to the general public. Unlike the robber barons of the Gilded Age or the investment bank titans of the 1980s, Larry maintained a deliberately modest public profile. He lived in the same Scarsdale house he had purchased in the 1980s, drove himself to work in a relatively modest sedan, and avoided the society pages that chronicled the extravagances of other Wall Street billionaires. The few journalists who profiled him invariably described a thoughtful, soft-spoken executive who seemed genuinely surprised by his own success. But behind this carefully cultivated image of Midwestern humility lay a systematic accumulation of power that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. BlackRock's influence extended far beyond traditional asset management into the political and regulatory spheres that governed how global markets operated. The firm's executives maintained regular contact with Federal Reserve officials, Treasury Department staff, and congressional leadership from both parties. BlackRock's research reports on economic policy were quietly circulated among government decision-makers months before they became public. The firm's crisis management expertise made it an unofficial consultant during every major market disruption. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the true extent of BlackRock's influence over global economic policy. As traditional investment banks collapsed and insurance companies teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, government officials turned to Larry and his team for analysis of which institutions could be saved and which had to be allowed to fail. BlackRock's Aladdin system provided the only comprehensive view of counterparty risks across the entire financial system, making the firm indispensable to crisis management efforts. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson requested daily briefings from BlackRock analysts during the most critical weeks of the crisis. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke consulted with Larry before implementing quantitative easing programs. The decisions that determined which banks received bailout funding and which were forced into bankruptcy were made with extensive input from BlackRock's risk management experts. In effect, a private asset management firm had become the analytical arm of the U.S. government's crisis response. The crisis also demonstrated how BlackRock's massive scale could influence market outcomes independent of government policy. When the firm's portfolio managers decided to increase or decrease exposure to particular sectors, the resulting capital flows were large enough to determine which companies survived the downturn and which did not. BlackRock's decision to maintain positions in certain banks while liquidating others became self-fulfilling prophecies as other institutional investors followed the firm's lead. This power was exercised with remarkable discretion. BlackRock never issued press releases about its crisis-related activities or sought public credit for its role in stabilizing financial markets. Larry avoided television interviews and congressional testimony that might have drawn attention to his firm's influence over government policy. The strategy was deliberate. Maintaining power required avoiding the kind of public scrutiny that had destroyed previous generations of financial titans. The firm's influence extended beyond crisis management into the everyday operations of corporate America. By 2010, BlackRock was the largest shareholder in 238 of the companies included in the S&P 500 index. The firm's proxy voting decisions on corporate governance issues effectively determined the outcomes of shareholder elections at major corporations. CEOs who wanted to implement strategic changes or executive compensation packages, first needed to secure BlackRock's approval through carefully orchestrated meetings with the firm's corporate governance specialists. This shareholder influence was amplified by BlackRock's coordination with other major asset management firms. While antitrust laws prohibited explicit cooperation among competing investment managers, the reality of institutional investing created implicit coordination. When BlackRock's governance team decided to vote against a particular executive compensation proposal, Vanguard and State Street, the other members of the Big Three passive asset managers, typically followed suit. Together, these three firms controlled enough shares to determine the outcome of virtually any corporate governance vote. The implications were staggering. A small group of investment professionals, accountable primarily to their own shareholders rather than the broader public, had acquired effective control over the strategic decisions of America's largest corporations. Corporate executives increasingly found themselves answerable not to dispersed public shareholders or even traditional activist investors, but to a handful of asset management giants whose investment committees met in private and whose decision-making processes were largely opaque. Larry understood both the potential and the risks of this accumulated power. On one hand, BlackRock's influence could be used to promote better corporate governance, more sustainable business practices, and more efficient capital allocation. The firm's annual letters to CEOs increasingly focused on environmental, social, and governance (ESG) issues, using shareholder voting power to pressure companies toward more responsible behavior. BlackRock's support for climate change disclosures and board diversity initiatives drove corporate policy changes throughout the economy. On the other hand, the concentration of so much power in a single institution created systemic risks that threatened the foundations of democratic capitalism. If BlackRock's investment decisions were influenced by political considerations or personal relationships rather than purely financial analysis, the firm could distort market outcomes in ways that harmed economic efficiency and democratic accountability. The potential for conflicts of interest was enormous. BlackRock simultaneously advised governments on economic policy, managed assets for sovereign wealth funds, and held major positions in companies that benefited from government contracts and regulatory decisions. The solution to this dilemma required unprecedented care in how BlackRock's power was exercised. Larry established extensive internal controls designed to prevent conflicts of interest and ensure that investment decisions were based solely on fiduciary responsibilities to clients. The firm hired former government officials to advise on ethical issues and retained outside auditors to monitor compliance with regulatory requirements. BlackRock's executives underwent regular ethics training and were required to disclose any personal relationships that might influence their professional judgment. But internal controls, however well designed, could not address the fundamental question of democratic accountability. BlackRock's power over corporate America and influence on government policy were exercised by private individuals accountable primarily to the firm's own shareholders. There was no mechanism for the broader public to influence how this power was used, no electoral process through which citizens could express approval or disapproval of BlackRock's governance decisions. The traditional response to such concerns, increased government regulation, posed its own problems. Regulating BlackRock's investment activities risked damaging the efficiency and innovation that had made the firm successful. More troubling, the firm's influence over regulatory agencies made it unclear whether government oversight would be truly independent or would instead be captured by the very institution it was supposed to supervise. As these contradictions became increasingly apparent, Larry began to recognize that BlackRock needed more than just internal controls and government relations strategies. The firm needed a secure location where its most sensitive decisions could be made away from public scrutiny, where government officials could consult with BlackRock executives without creating public records, and where the firm's leadership could coordinate responses to crises that might require actions beyond the scope of traditional asset management. The search for such a facility led to a 47-acre estate in North Salem, New York, that would serve as more than just a weekend retreat. The property would become BlackRock's true command center, a place where the invisible hand of the market would reveal itself to be very human indeed, where the democratic implications of concentrated financial power would be addressed through private conversations rather than public debate, where the future of global capitalism would be decided behind walls high enough to ensure that the world's attention remained focused on what happened inside rather than who controlled what happened outside. The boy from Van Nuys had built an empire. Now he needed a fortress from which to rule it. Dark influence. The purchase of the North Salem estate in December 2007 appeared in public records as a routine real estate transaction. Lake Road Property Holdings, LLC, a Delaware limited liability company, acquired 47 acres of pristine Westchester County countryside for $14.3 million from the estate of industrialist Harrison Wheeler. Local newspapers, if they mentioned the sale at all, noted only that another wealthy executive had joined North Salem's exclusive community of business leaders and entertainment figures seeking privacy within commuting distance of Manhattan. What public records did not reveal was the elaborate corporate structure designed to obscure the true buyer's identity. Lake Road Property Holdings was controlled by 3 other LLCs, each incorporated in different states, each with different registered agents, all ultimately traced back to trusts administered by BlackRock's legal department. The property deed listed no individual names, only corporate entities whose beneficial ownership was hidden behind layers of legal complexity that would have impressed money laundering investigators. The estate itself seemed unremarkable by the standards of Westchester County wealth. The main residence was a 12,000-square-foot Georgian Revival mansion built in 1923 by textile magnate Cornelius Ashford, featuring the kind of architectural details: marble fireplaces, coffered ceilings, hand-carved moldings that proclaimed old money rather than new. The grounds included formal gardens designed by Olmsted Brothers, a regulation tennis court, and a carriage house converted into a 6-car garage. To casual observers, it appeared to be exactly what it purported to be: a country retreat for successful financial executives seeking escape from Manhattan's intensity. But the architectural plans filed with Westchester County during the 18 months following the purchase told a different story. The renovation permits described $31.7 million in improvements that went far beyond typical luxury upgrades. The plans showed blast-resistant construction reinforcing the mansion's foundation and walls, underground facilities expanding the basement into a 4,000-square-foot complex with independent power, water, and communication systems, above-ground additions including a helipad disguised as a garden pavilion, and a communications tower camouflaged as a colonial-era cupola. Most significantly, the plans detailed construction of what the permits euphemistically described as a conference center beneath the estate's east wing. The facility included a situation room equipped with secure satellite links to major financial exchanges, government agencies, and BlackRock's global offices. Electromagnetic shielding prevented electronic surveillance. Backup power systems could maintain operations for weeks during national emergencies. The construction specifications read like military contracting documents rather than residential renovation permits. The The transformation of the estate into BlackRock's shadow headquarters proceeded with remarkable discretion. Construction crews were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and were supervised by security personnel with military and intelligence backgrounds. Delivery trucks arrived only during specified hours and followed routes designed to avoid observation by neighbors or media. Local building inspectors were escorted through the construction site by lawyers who carefully controlled what could be observed and documented. The completed facility became operational in late 2009, just as BlackRock was consolidating its position as the world's most influential asset management firm through the Barclays Global Investors acquisition. The timing was not coincidental. The financial crisis had demonstrated both BlackRock's indispensability to government policymaking and the firm's need for a secure location where sensitive discussions could occur without creating public records or attracting media attention. The estate's first major test came during the European debt crisis of 2010-2012, when the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department requested BlackRock's analysis of potential contagion effects if Greece, Portugal, or Spain defaulted on their sovereign debt obligations. The complexity of these analyses required access to confidential banking data that could not be transmitted over conventional communication channels, even those protected by standard encryption. The solution was a series of meetings at the North Salem facility, where European Central Bank officials, IMF executives, and U.S. government representatives could review BlackRock's proprietary risk models without leaving digital footprints. These crisis management sessions established a pattern that would define the estate's role for the next decade. When major financial institutions faced potential bankruptcy, when currency crises threatened emerging market economies, when geopolitical events created systemic market risks, the relevant decision-makers gathered behind the stone walls of Larry Fink's country estate. The meetings were never acknowledged publicly, appeared on no official calendars, and generated no public records. They existed in the shadows of democratic government, where unelected financial executives exercised influence that elected officials could only envy. The guest logs from these meetings, obtained through David and Rich's investigation, revealed the scope of BlackRock's informal power over economic policy. Federal Reserve Vice Chair Janet Yellen visited the estate 6 times between 2011 and 2014, always accompanied by senior Fed staff, and always during weekends when their movements would attract minimal media attention. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner met with Larry at the estate on 12 occasions during his tenure, discussing topics that ranged from bank stress testing methodologies to sovereign debt restructuring proposals. International visitors were even more remarkable. European Central Bank President Mario Draghi spent a weekend at the estate in September 2012, finalizing details of the bond buying program that would eventually stabilize European financial markets. Bank of Japan Governor Haruhiko Kuroda consulted with BlackRock's analysts at the estate before implementing the quantitative easing policies that transformed Japanese monetary policy. Chinese central bank officials visited twice in 2013, seeking BlackRock's advice on managing the transition from an export-driven to consumption-driven economy. But the estate's influence extended far beyond central banking and monetary policy into corporate governance issues that affected every major American company. Beginning in 2013, Larry began hosting annual CEO summits that brought together the chief executives of BlackRock's largest portfolio holdings for private discussions of strategic issues. The guest lists read like a directory of American corporate power: Tim Cook of Apple, Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, ExxonMobil's Rex Tillerson, and dozens of other leaders whose companies accounted for trillions in market capitalization. These CEO gatherings were portrayed as informal networking events, but their actual purpose was far more consequential. Larry used these meetings to communicate BlackRock's expectations for corporate behavior on environmental, social, and governance issues. CEOs who attended left with clear understanding of what policies BlackRock expected them to implement, what strategic decisions the firm would support through proxy voting, and what management changes might be necessary to maintain BlackRock's backing. The influence of these private conversations became apparent in the systematic changes that swept corporate America throughout the 2010s. The wave of diversity initiatives, climate change commitments, and stakeholder capitalism rhetoric that transformed corporate communications was not the result of spontaneous executive enlightenment or grassroots shareholder pressure. It was the outcome of carefully orchestrated guidance from BlackRock's leadership, communicated through private meetings where corporate executives learned what was required to maintain the support of the world's largest asset manager. The estate also served as BlackRock's coordination center for what critics would later term financial market manipulation, but which the firm characterized as systematic risk management. When major market dislocations threatened systemic stability, Larry's team used the estate's secure communication systems to coordinate responses with other major institutional investors. The goal was not to manipulate prices for profit, but to prevent the kind of panic selling that could trigger broader financial crises. These coordination efforts were most visible during the March 2020 market crash triggered by COVID-19 lockdowns. As equity markets plummeted and corporate bond markets seized up, BlackRock's estate became the command center for an unprecedented intervention. Using secure lines, Larry's team coordinated with pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies to provide orderly selling that prevented complete market breakdown. The effort succeeded in stabilizing markets, but it also demonstrated how a small group of asset managers could override normal market mechanisms when they chose to act in coordination. The legal and ethical implications of these activities occupied a gray area that regulators had never directly addressed. BlackRock was simultaneously advising government agencies on crisis response, coordinating with other institutional investors on market interventions, and managing trillions in assets for clients who were unaware of the firm's broader activities. The potential conflicts of interest were staggering, but the complex web of relationships was so integral to financial system functioning that unwinding it might have caused the very instability that the arrangements were designed to prevent. Critics who attempted to draw public attention to BlackRock's concentration of power found themselves confronting not just the firm's legal resources, but a broader establishment that had come to depend on BlackRock's crisis management capabilities. Academic researchers who published papers questioning the democratic implications of concentrated asset management found their university endowments, many of which were BlackRock clients, pressured to reconsider their hiring and tenure decisions. Journalists who investigated BlackRock's government relationships discovered that their news organization's pension funds were managed by the firm they were attempting to scrutinize. The few government officials who attempted to address these concerns through regulatory action found themselves outmaneuvered by BlackRock's sophisticated lobbying operation and regulatory capture strategies. The firm's executives included numerous former Federal Reserve and Treasury Department officials who maintained close relationships with their former colleagues. BlackRock's consulting contracts with government agencies created financial relationships that complicated any effort to regulate the firm's activities independently. By 2015, the North Salem estate had become more than just BlackRock's private command center. It was the unofficial capital of a shadow financial government that operated parallel to, but largely independent of democratic institutions. The decisions made behind its stone walls affected global capital flows, corporate strategies, and government policies in ways that voters could neither observe nor influence. The concentration of power that the estate represented challenged fundamental assumptions about democratic accountability and market-based resource allocation. Yet the estate's operations remained almost completely hidden from public view. Local residents knew only that their wealthy neighbor occasionally hosted business gatherings that brought helicopters and black SUVs to their quiet corner of Westchester County. Financial journalists who suspected the estate's importance lacked the access needed to document its activities. Government oversight agencies that might have investigated BlackRock's concentration of power were either captured by the firm's influence or dependent on its crisis management capabilities. The man who had learned to read the stories that numbers tell had written the most consequential story of all: how democratic capitalism could be transformed into oligarchic control without anyone noticing the transition was occurring. The estate in North Salem was both symbol and instrument of this transformation, a fortress where the invisible hand of the market revealed itself to be very human indeed. Global control. By 2018, the estate in North Salem had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of American finance, a private facility that functioned as the de facto command center for global economic policy. The transformation was complete, but it had occurred so gradually, and with such careful attention to maintaining plausible deniability, that even sophisticated observers of financial markets struggled to understand the full scope of what had been created. The guest registries from this period, obtained through David and Rich's investigation, revealed the truly international character of BlackRock's influence. The estate hosted delegations from the Bank of England, the German Bundesbank, the Swiss National Bank, and central banks from Australia, Canada, and Brazil. These were not courtesy visits or informal consultations, but working meetings where critical policy decisions were developed through private negotiations that bypassed normal diplomatic channels. The November 2018 Summit on Cryptocurrency Regulation exemplified how the estate functioned as a parallel government institution. As Bitcoin and other digital assets approached mainstream adoption, traditional financial regulators struggled to develop coherent policy responses. The solution was a weekend gathering at North Salem that brought together central bank governors from the G7 nations, Securities and Exchange Commission leadership, and BlackRock's own cryptocurrency specialists. The meeting's outcomes shaped regulatory approaches across multiple jurisdictions. The Federal Reserve's skeptical stance towards central bank digital currencies, the SEC's aggressive enforcement actions against cryptocurrency exchanges, and the European Union's comprehensive crypto regulations all traced back to consensus reached during private discussions in Larry Fink's mansion. The public justifications for these policies cited consumer protection and financial stability concerns, but the actual decision-making process occurred in a setting where democratic input was structurally impossible. BlackRock's influence over corporate governance reached its apex during this same period through the annual CEO summits that had become mandatory attendance events for leaders of major publicly traded companies. The 2019 gathering, held over Memorial Day weekend, included chief executives representing $12 trillion in market capitalization. The agenda officially focused on stakeholder capitalism and sustainable investing, but the real business occurred during private sessions, where Larry communicated BlackRock's expectations with unprecedented directness. The impact of these conversations became visible within months. Companies that attended the 2019 summit announced climate commitments, diversity initiatives, and stakeholder governance reforms with remarkable synchronization. The wave of corporate social responsibility announcements that dominated business news throughout late 2019 and early 2020 was not coincidental. It was the result of coordinated guidance from the world's largest asset manager, communicated through private meetings where CEO attendance was functionally mandatory. The estate's role as a crisis management center reached its highest profile during the COVID-19 pandemic, when market volatility and economic uncertainty created systemic risks that threatened global financial stability. As lockdown orders triggered the sharpest market decline since the Great Depression, traditional government response mechanisms proved inadequate to the scale and speed of the crisis. The solution was an unprecedented coordination effort managed from BlackRock's North Salem facility. The estate's secure communication systems allowed real-time coordination between BlackRock's global offices, central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and major institutional investors. When corporate bond markets seized up in March 2020, threatening to trigger a cascade of corporate bankruptcies, the coordinated response was developed during a 48-hour session at the estate that included Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, Treasury Secretary Stephen M. Mnuchin, and the heads of major pension funds representing $8 trillion in assets. The resulting intervention combined official government actions, Federal Reserve bond purchases, and Treasury Department lending facilities, with coordinated private sector support that prevented complete market breakdown. BlackRock's role in designing and implementing this response was crucial, but it was also largely invisible to the general public. The firm received a $130 million contract to manage Federal Reserve bond purchases, but the extent of its influence over crisis policy was never formally acknowledged. Critics who attempted to draw attention to these extraordinary arrangements found themselves confronting not just BlackRock's resources, but a broader financial establishment that had come to depend on the firm's crisis management capability. Academic researchers, investigative journalists, and even some government officials recognized that the concentration of power at the North Salem estate posed fundamental challenges to democratic governance, but the practical difficulties of addressing these concerns seemed insurmountable. The regulatory capture was particularly sophisticated. BlackRock's executives included numerous former Federal Reserve and Treasury Department officials who maintained close personal relationships with their former colleagues. The firm's consulting contracts with government agencies created financial dependencies that complicated any effort at independent oversight. More subtly, BlackRock's crisis management capabilities had become so integral to financial system stability that regulators feared that aggressive action against the firm might trigger the very instability that their oversight was designed to prevent. The international dimension of BlackRock's influence posed even greater challenges to democratic accountability. The firm's coordination with foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds occurred through private relationships that bypassed normal diplomatic channels. When BlackRock's executives met with Chinese government officials at the North Salem estate, they were engaging in what amounted to shadow diplomacy on economic issues that affected national security interests. The most troubling example occurred in late 2019, when BlackRock's leadership used the estate to negotiate expanded access to Chinese financial markets in exchange for the firm's support for Chinese state-owned enterprises seeking international investment. The discussions included commitments that BlackRock would use its shareholder voting power to oppose shareholder resolutions critical of Chinese human rights practices. These commitments were never disclosed to BlackRock's clients, many of whom might have objected to their retirement savings being used to support authoritarian governance. By 2020, the estate had become the nerve center of a global financial network that operated largely independent of democratic oversight or public accountability. The decisions made behind its walls affected interest rates, currency exchange rates, corporate strategies, and government policies across multiple continents. Yet the processes through which these decisions were reached remained completely opaque to the voters and citizens whose lives they affected. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a particularly clear illustration of how the estate's influence operated in practice. While elected officials struggled with competing advice from epidemiologists, economists, and political advisors, BlackRock's leadership used its unique position to coordinate economic responses that transcended national boundaries. The firm's recommendations influenced lockdown policies, fiscal stimulus programs, and monetary policy responses across multiple countries. These recommendations were developed through private consultations that brought together public health officials, economic policymakers, and corporate executives in sessions that generated no public records and were subject to no democratic oversight. The resulting policies may have been economically optimal, but they were developed through processes that fundamentally violated principles of democratic accountability and public participation in governance. The concentration of power at the North Salem estate also created unprecedented opportunities for self-dealing and conflicts of interest. BlackRock simultaneously advised governments on crisis response policies, managed investments for sovereign wealth funds, and held major positions in companies that benefited from government contracts and regulatory decisions. The potential for the firm's private interests to influence its public policy advice was enormous, but the opacity of the estate's operations made it impossible to identify specific instances of abuse. Perhaps most troubling was the complete absence of any mechanism for public oversight or accountability. Unlike elected officials or government agencies, BlackRock's leadership faced no electoral consequences for their policy recommendations, no congressional oversight of their activities, and no judicial review of their decisions. The firm operated in a legal and political gray area where enormous power could be exercised without corresponding responsibility to the democratic processes that legitimated government authority. The estate in North Salem had become the physical embodiment of a fundamental transformation in how global capitalism operated. Power that had once been exercised through democratic institutions and market mechanisms had been concentrated in a private facility where unelected individuals made decisions that affected billions of people worldwide. The transformation had occurred gradually, through processes that maintained the appearance of normal market operations and democratic governance, but the cumulative effect was revolutionary. The boy from Van Nuys had not merely built a financial empire. He had constructed a parallel government that operated through private relationships rather than public institutions. The estate was both symbol and instrument of this shadow state, a fortress where the myths of democratic capitalism were quietly discarded in favor of more efficient forms of oligarchic control. Mansion secrets. The documents that David and Rich discovered in 2019 revealed not just the extent of BlackRock's influence over global economic policy, but the elaborate operational security measures that protected the estate's activities from public scrutiny. The papers included security protocols, visitor logs, communication procedures, and financial records that painted a detailed picture of how the world's most powerful private financial institution conducted its most sensitive business. The security arrangements alone represented a multi-million-dollar operation that rivaled those protecting heads of state. The estate's perimeter was monitored by thermal imaging cameras, motion sensors, and buried cable detection systems that could identify approaching vehicles or pedestrians from over a mile away. The property's stone walls, which appeared decorative to casual observers, actually incorporated ballistic-resistant materials and electronic surveillance equipment that created an impenetrable security bubble. Access to the estate required clearance through multiple security checkpoints that verified visitors' identities using biometric scanners, background checks, and real-time coordination with federal law enforcement databases. Even invited guests underwent security screening that exceeded airport protocols, including electronic device searches and communication monitoring that continued throughout their visits. The message was unmistakable. What happened at the estate stayed at the estate. The visitor logs revealed patterns of access that illuminated BlackRock's operational priorities during critical periods. During the 2016 presidential election, the estate hosted separate meetings with advisors to both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, ensuring that BlackRock's interests would be protected regardless of electoral outcomes. The sessions included briefings on financial regulatory policy, trade relationships, and monetary policy that allowed BlackRock to position its portfolios in advance of policy changes. Similar patterns emerged around major market events and geopolitical crises. Before Brexit negotiations reached critical phases, the estate hosted meetings between BlackRock executives and both British Treasury officials and European Central Bank representatives. Before major Federal Reserve policy announcements, the estate was visited by Fed officials whose presence allowed BlackRock to adjust its investment strategies ahead of market movements. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. The most sensitive documents revealed the estate's role in coordinating responses to systemic financial risks that threatened global market stability. During the Turkish currency crisis of 2018, BlackRock's leadership used the estate's secure communication systems to coordinate with other major institutional investors, preventing the kind of panic selling that could have triggered broader emerging market contagion. The coordination was successful, but it also demonstrated how a small group of asset managers could override normal market mechanisms when they chose to act collectively. The estate's underground facilities included capabilities that went far beyond normal business operations. The Situation Room featured real-time data feeds from every major financial exchange, government economic agencies, and BlackRock's global offices. During market crises, this information advantage allowed BlackRock's leadership to make investment decisions hours or even days ahead of competitors who lacked access to the same intelligence sources. More troubling were the communication intercept capabilities that allowed BlackRock to monitor trading activities and policy discussions at other financial institutions. While the firm maintained that these capabilities were used solely for risk management and crisis prevention, the potential for abuse was enormous. BlackRock could potentially gain advanced knowledge of major transactions, regulatory announcements, and policy changes that would provide illegal insider trading advantages. The estate's financial records revealed the true cost of maintaining BlackRock's shadow government operations. Beyond the initial $45 million investment in property acquisition and renovation, the firm spent over $12 million annually on security, communications, and operational expenses directly related to the estate's role as a parallel policy center. These costs were buried in BlackRock's general administrative expenses and never disclosed to shareholders or clients as political activities. The records also showed how BlackRock used the estate to reward government officials and regulatory personnel, whose cooperation was essential to the firm's interests. Weekend retreats for Federal Reserve staff were described as educational seminars, while entertainment expenses for Treasury Department officials were characterized as policy consultation fees. The arrangements stayed within legal boundaries, but they created financial relationships that compromised the independence of government oversight. Perhaps most revealing were the internal communications that showed how BlackRock's leadership viewed their accumulation of quasi-governmental power. Rather than expressing concern about democratic accountability or market fairness, The documents revealed satisfaction with having created what one executive described as a more efficient system for economic coordination. The implications for democratic governance were seen as acceptable costs of preventing financial instability. The estate's guest accommodations were designed to facilitate the kind of private relationship building that made this coordination possible. The mansion's 12-bedroom suites allowed extended visits where government officials, corporate executives, and BlackRock leadership could develop personal bonds that transcended formal professional relationships. The informal atmosphere encouraged candid discussions that would have been impossible in official government settings. These personal relationships became particularly important during crisis periods when rapid coordination was essential. The 2020 pandemic response demonstrated how the estate's network of relationships allowed BlackRock to influence government policy through private communications that bypassed normal democratic processes. While Congress debated stimulus legislation, the estate hosted meetings where actual crisis response policies were developed through private negotiations. The estate also served as BlackRock's intelligence gathering center for geopolitical developments that could affect global markets. The guest logs showed regular visits from foreign policy officials, military contractors, and international business leaders, whose insights helped BlackRock anticipate geopolitical developments before they became public knowledge. This intelligence advantage provided enormous benefits for investment positioning and risk management. The operational security surrounding these intelligence activities was extraordinary. Visitors' electronic devices were isolated in electromagnetic shielding that prevented any external communication. Meeting rooms featured white noise generators and electronic countermeasures that defeated sophisticated surveillance equipment. The precautions reflected both the sensitivity of information discussed and the potential legal consequences if these activities attracted official attention. The documents revealed that BlackRock's leadership was fully aware of the legal and ethical risks created by the estate's operations. Internal legal memoranda warned about potential violations of lobbying disclosure requirements, antitrust laws, and securities regulations. But the firm's attorneys had developed elaborate justifications that characterized the estate's activities as normal business operations rather than political influence activities. The most damaging document was a strategic planning memorandum that explicitly discussed the estate's role in maintaining BlackRock's influence over government policy regardless of electoral outcomes. The memo described specific strategies for ensuring that both Democratic and Republican administrations would continue to rely on BlackRock's crisis management capabilities, effectively insulating the firm from normal political accountability. These revelations, when they finally became public through Enrich's investigation, represented the first comprehensive look at how the world's largest asset management firm had constructed a parallel government that operated through private relationships rather than democratic institutions. The estate in North Salem was both symbol and instrument of this shadow state, a fortress where the visible hand of democratic governance was replaced by the invisible hand of private power. Shadow legacy. Today, the estate in North Salem stands as both monument and metaphor for the transformation of American capitalism in the 21st century. The 47 acres of manicured grounds and Georgian Revival architecture remain pristine, maintained by a staff that arrives each morning and departs each evening without speaking to local residents about what they observe behind the stone walls. To casual observers driving past on June Road, it appears to be nothing more than another wealthy executive's country retreat, indistinguishable from the dozens of similar estates that dot Westchester County's exclusive suburbs. But the documents uncovered by David Enrich's investigation have forever changed how we understand the relationship between private wealth and public power in contemporary America. The estate represents the physical embodiment of a system where democratic accountability has been quietly replaced by oligarchic efficiency, where the messy processes of public debate and electoral choice have given way to private coordination among unelected elites who possess the knowledge and resources to manage global financial markets. The irony is that Larry Fink never intended to build a shadow government. His journey from the shoe salesman's son in Van Nuys to the most powerful unelected figure in global finance was driven by a genuine belief that sophisticated risk management and quantitative analysis could create more stable and efficient financial markets. The estate began as a secure location where BlackRock's leadership could coordinate crisis responses and strategic planning without the distractions and security risks of urban headquarters. But power, once accumulated, creates its own logic and demands its own protection. The estate evolved from crisis management center to policy coordination facility to the nerve center of a parallel government, because the scale of BlackRock's influence made such evolution inevitable. When a single firm controls enough assets to influence the strategic decisions of every major corporation and the policy choices of every major government, normal boundaries between private business and public authority become meaningless. The COVID-19 pandemic provided the clearest demonstration of how completely these boundaries have dissolved. While elected officials struggled with competing advice and political pressures, BlackRock's leadership used the estate's secure facilities to coordinate economic responses across multiple countries and industries. The firm's recommendations influenced lockdown policies, stimulus programs, and monetary policy decisions that affected billions of people worldwide. Yet these recommendations were developed through private processes that were accountable to no democratic institution. The estate's guest logs from March 2020 read like a directory of global power. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell spent 3 days at the facility during the most critical period of market volatility. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde participated in strategy sessions via secure video links. Chinese central bank officials joined discussions about coordinating monetary policy responses. The scale of private coordination was unprecedented, but it was also invisible to the democratic processes that supposedly govern these institutions. Critics who have attempted to draw attention to the democratic implications of the estate's operations face a fundamental problem. The system that BlackRock has created appears to work more efficiently than traditional democratic processes. During financial crises, the estate's coordination capabilities prevent market breakdowns that could cause enormous economic damage. During normal periods, BlackRock's influence over corporate governance promotes environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and stakeholder capitalism that many progressives support. The efficiency of oligarchic coordination creates a powerful argument for accepting the concentration of power that the estate represents. Why should economic policy be subject to the ignorance and emotional volatility of democratic politics when sophisticated experts can make better decisions through private consultation? Why should crisis response be delayed by congressional debate when immediate action could prevent systemic financial collapse? The estate embodies the technocratic ideal of governance by expertise rather than governance by consent. Yet the concentration of power at North Salem also demonstrates the fundamental incompatibility between democratic governance and financial oligarchy. The estate's operations bypass every institutional safeguard that democratic societies have developed to prevent the abuse of power. Electoral accountability, constitutional constraints, judicial review, legislative oversight, and freedom of information. BlackRock's leadership exercises influence over public policy through private relationships that are AC. accountable only to the firm's own shareholders. The international dimension of the estate's influence poses even greater challenges to democratic accountability. BlackRock's coordination with foreign governments and sovereign wealth funds amounts to shadow diplomacy that circumvents normal treaty processes and legislative oversight. When the firm's executives negotiate investment agreements with Chinese state enterprises or coordinate policy responses with European central banks, they are engaging in activities that affect national security interests but remain completely invisible to democratic oversight. The estate has also become a symbol of the broader transformation of corporate power in the 21st century. The rise of passive investing and index funds has concentrated shareholder voting power in the hands of a few large asset management firms that exercise control over corporate America without owning companies in any traditional sense. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street collectively control enough shares to determine the outcome of virtually any shareholder vote, yet they face no accountability to the workers, customers, and communities affected by their governance decisions. The environmental and social policies that these firms promote through their shareholder voting power may be substantively desirable, but the process through which these policies are implemented bypasses democratic institutions entirely. Corporate sustainability commitments and diversity initiatives are imposed through private coordination among asset managers rather than through legislation, regulation, or consumer choice. The result may be better corporate behavior, but it is achieved through oligarchic control rather than democratic governance. The estate's influence over media coverage of financial issues represents another dimension of its anti-democratic impact. Major news organizations depend on BlackRock for pension fund management, advertising revenue, and expert commentary on market developments. This financial dependence creates systematic bias in favor of BlackRock's interests and against investigation of the firm's concentration of power. The few journalists who have attempted to examine the estate's operations have found their own employers reluctant to support investigations that might jeopardize business relationships. The legal and regulatory capture that protects the estate's operations from official scrutiny reflects the broader corruption of democratic institutions by concentrated financial power. BlackRock's executives include numerous former government officials who maintain close relationships with their replacements. The firm's consulting contracts with regulatory agencies create financial dependencies that compromise independent oversight. The revolving door between BlackRock and government service ensures that official policy will remain friendly to the firm's interests regardless of electoral outcomes. Perhaps most troubling is the complete absence of any mechanism for public accountability or democratic control over the estate's operations. Unlike elected officials, BlackRock's leadership faces no electoral consequences for their policy recommendations. Unlike government agencies, the firm operates under no constitutional constraints or judicial review. Unlike public institutions, BlackRock provides no transparency about its decision-making processes or democratic participation in its governance structures. The estate in North Salem represents the successful privatization of governmental authority without the consent or even the awareness of the governed. The transformation has been accomplished through market mechanisms that maintain the appearance of democratic capitalism while concentrating effective power in private hands. The result is a system that may be more efficient than democratic governance, but it is also fundamentally incompatible with the principles of popular sovereignty and constitutional government that supposedly define American political institutions. Standing today at the stone gates of the estate, looking up at the Georgian Revival facade that conceals the most powerful private policy center in human history, visitors might wonder whether democratic capitalism can survive the concentration of power that the mansion represents. The boy from Van Nuys succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in building a financial empire. But the price of that success may be the democratic institutions that made his rise possible in the first place. The invisible hand of the market has revealed itself to be very human indeed, belonging to a small group of unelected individuals who exercise more influence over economic policy than most heads of government. Whether this concentration of power can be reconciled with democratic accountability, or whether it represents the quiet transformation of American capitalism into something entirely different, remains the most important question facing contempt. Rare political economy. The estate holds its secrets behind walls high enough to ensure that the world's attention remains focused on what happens inside rather than who controls what happens outside. But the documents are now public, and the questions they raise cannot be answered through private consultation or oligarchic coordination. That is the dark story of BlackRock's private estate, Larry Fink's mansion.